At her sister's wedding, my best friend caught the bouquet, then reached my table and took my hand. She caught it clean. Both hands up, no fumbling, the way she does everything she decides to actually do. The ribbons trailed behind the roses in the low October light, and the women around her laughed and grabbed at her shoulders, and someone said something that made her roll her eyes, and then she turned, and I was already looking. That was the mistake. I should have looked away the way I had been looking away for the better part of a decade, smooth and practiced, the reflex of a man who knows which things he is not allowed to want. But I did not look away this time, and she saw me, and something in her face went still in a way that had nothing to do with the noise around her. She walked across the room. Not rushed, not casual either. Deliberate, the way you walk when you have made a decision and you are not going to let yourself unsee it. She still had the bouquet in her left hand. She came to my table, and the other guests there had already drifted toward the bar, so the chair beside me was empty, and she sat down in it, and she set the bouquet on the white tablecloth between us, and then she put her right hand over my left hand where it was resting next to my water glass. Her fingers pressed down once, firm and quiet, and she did not say anything, and the string quartet was playing something soft, and I thought of that question she had asked me in the car, in the rain, a week ago, and finally understood what she had been asking. Let me back up. I have been fixing watches since I was 24 years old, mechanical watches specifically, the kind that run on nothing but the tension stored in a coiled spring and a series of gears small enough to lose between the floor tiles if you breathe wrong. I have a shop on Northeast Alberta Street in Portland, 8 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a glass counter and a workbench and 2 stools and a small sign that says Owen Watch Repair in the window. I have been there 11 years. I know how to sit still for hours. I know how to work with things that require patience and a very light hand, things that will break if you force them. The thing about mechanical watches that most people do not know is that they are not passive. When you wind a mechanical watch, you are storing energy, compressing a spring that wants to release, and the entire mechanism is a system designed to control how that energy escapes, gear by gear, tooth by tooth, one tiny measured click at a time. The spring does not stop wanting to uncoil. It is always pushing. The machinery just decides the rate. I have spent 11 years building relationships with that tension, learning to respect it, learning the difference between a spring that is at proper tension and one that is overwound, which will break or underwound, which will stop. The line between holding on and letting go is thinner than most people think, and the cost of getting it wrong is that the whole thing quits. I learned this about watches. I also learned it about myself, though in a different order and at greater expense. My name is Owen, and I am 38 years old, and I learned to sit still in my marriage before I learned it in my shop, though the lessons were different. In my marriage I sat still because I did not know what else to do, because Adrienne and I had built something that looked right from the outside, a house in the Woodstock neighborhood and a routine, and a dog named after a river, and we were kind to each other, genuinely kind, and that kindness made the distance between us harder to talk about, not easier. We were not angry, we were not unfaithful. We simply grew into 2 people who needed different things and were too polite to say so for 4 years too long, and when we finally said it, there was no drama, only relief. And then a very quiet grief that lasted longer than the relief did. What I took from the end of my marriage was not bitterness. Bitterness would have been easier to work with, something you can locate and scrape off. What I took was a very clear understanding of my own limitations, the specific ways in which I was capable of being too careful to save something already slipping, too measured to act before the mechanism wound down. I sat with my failures and catalogued them the way I catalogue the components of a watch I am disassembling, laid out on the bench cloth in the order they came apart, so I do not reassemble them wrong. I thought I understood what I had done. I thought I was being rigorous. The year after Adrienne moved out, I spent most evenings at the bench. I was not hiding, or not only hiding, I was also genuinely trying to understand something about the relationship between care and cowardice, whether it was possible to be so attentive to a thing that you failed to be honest with it. A watch does not need your honesty. It needs your attention, your patience, your clean hands, and your steady light, and your willingness to sit with it for as long as it takes. A person needs all of those things and also something else. Something that requires you to say out loud what you mean, to close the distance between what you feel and what you do about it, to accept that precision is not the same thing as truth. I had confused those things for years. I am precise by training and by nature, and I had mistaken that precision for emotional intelligence, which it is not. Emotional intelligence is knowing when to put down the loop and just say the thing. I was 35 years old and recently divorced and working 6 nights a week before I understood the difference. What I was actually doing, all that time, was applying watch repair logic to a feeling that does not operate on watch repair logic. You cannot disassemble a longing, clean it, and reassemble it in a controlled environment. Some things you have to run with the imperfections in. A watch with a slight magnetization will lose a few seconds a day and still tell you the time. You learn to live with the variance. You learn that good enough and running is more useful than perfect and still. Celeste came into my shop 9 years ago with a watch. Not her watch, she told me. Her grandmother's. Small, round face, white enamel dial, 17 jewels. The crystal scratched, but the movement still running. She set it on my counter and said she wanted it cleaned and the crystal replaced and whatever else it needed. And I asked her name for the ticket, and she said, Celeste Avery, 2 E's, and I wrote it down. She was wearing scrubs and a grey down vest, and her hair was in the practical braid of someone who had just come off a long shift, and she looked at the watch while I looked at it. And she said her grandmother had wound it every morning until she could no longer lift her arms, and after that, she had wound it herself every morning until her grandmother died. She came back 3 days later, paid in cash, thanked me without excess, and left. I remember thinking she had very good posture and seemed like someone who was usually somewhere else, in a different way than most people who seem somewhere else. Most people seem absent. She seemed present somewhere I could not see. She came back 6 months later with a different watch, this one hers, a slender field watch her father had given her when she graduated from nursing school, the crown worn smooth from use. After that, she came back every year or so with something that needed attention, and at some point I stopped writing her name on the ticket because I knew it. At some point she started staying 10 or 15 minutes after I gave the watch back, talking about whatever was in the air. The neighborhood, the hospital system, a book she had read, something she had seen on her walk over, and I looked forward to those 15 minutes more than I wanted to admit. At some point, and I cannot pinpoint exactly when, she became the person I called when I needed to think out loud. We had been friends by then for about 4 years. Actual friends, the kind who text each other photographs of broken things and send each other articles at midnight, the kind who call when something bad happens, and also when something stupid happens. When my father died, she drove 2 hours in the rain to sit in my kitchen and not say anything useful, which was more useful than anything anyone said. She sat at my kitchen table and drank tea and let me talk about my father's hands, the particular way he held a tool, and she did not tell me he was in a better place or that time heals or any of the things that are technically true and completely beside the point. She just stayed until it was late, and then she stayed a little longer, and when she finally left, she said, "I'll check on you tomorrow," and she did. When her relationship with the man she had been seeing for 2 years ended because he wanted children and she did not, she called me from the parking lot of the grocery store, where she had been crying in her car, and I talked to her until she could drive. I did not say anything about the future or how she would be fine. She had not asked me about the future, and she knew she would be fine. What she had actually asked, was, am I allowed to be sad about losing something I also knew was not right? And I said yes. That is exactly the kind of sad you are allowed to be. And she breathed out slowly on the other end of the phone and said, okay. And that was the conversation. The rule I had given myself, the first one, was that I would not look at her in a room the way I wanted to look at her. I had looked at her that way once, early in the friendship, before I had identified and named the thing that was happening inside me, and she had not looked back, and I had decided that meant something final. I was still married then, technically, though Adrian and I had already begun the polite archaeology of dividing our possessions, and I had decided that a man who was in the process of failing at the most important promise he had ever made was not in a position to want anything from anyone, especially not from the only person he could actually talk to. So I looked away, and I kept looking away, and it became a habit so deep I forgot I was doing it. The second rule was that I would not let us be alone together after 9 at night. This is embarrassing to admit because it sounds calculated in a way that was actually panicked, but there it is. Evenings with Celeste had a different quality than afternoons. The light was different, she was different. The space between a sentence and the next sentence was different, longer and softer and less careful. I did not trust myself in that space, so I made excuses. Early nights, work in the morning, the dog to feed. The dog was real, but the urgency was not. For years it worked, and I told myself it was sensible. The behavior of a man who understood his own limits. The third rule was simpler and harder. Do not let her know that you notice. Do not remember the small things out loud. Do not say you know she takes her coffee with 1 sugar on weekdays and black on weekends, because weekdays feel heavy and black coffee would make them heavier. Do not remember the name she gave the rosebush in front of her sister's house. The small white climbing variety she had pointed out to me once in passing 3 years ago. White Alba, she called it, which I had never heard before and looked up afterward and thought about for no reason I could justify. Do not remember that she reads the last page of every novel before she starts it, not because she cannot tolerate suspense, but because she says she needs to know a book is going somewhere before she agrees to go with it. Do not notice that she is left-handed, but wears her watch on her left wrist anyway, which means the crown digs into the side of her hand, and she has simply decided this is acceptable. I noticed all of it. I noticed it and filed it and said nothing, and this was the rule I was most certain I had kept, right up until the moment she caught the bouquet, and I understood from across the barn that she had been noticing me too, just as quietly, filing her own inventory, and that we had both been doing this for years in parallel, 2 people keeping the same careful record and never comparing notes. The strangest part, looking back on it, is that neither of us had been hiding. We had both been right there, present, specific, paying complete attention. We had simply agreed, without ever saying so, not to say what we were paying attention to. That is not the same as hiding. It is something more complicated, a kind of mutual patience, or mutual caution, or mutual something that did not have a name until a bouquet went up in a clean arc, and she reached for it without deciding to. I broke the first rule at the rehearsal dinner. Renata had chosen a barn venue outside Portland, a working farm that rented out its equipment barn on weekends, swept clean and strung with lights, and the rehearsal the Friday before the wedding was informal, 30 people. Renata's fiancé, Marcus's family up from Sacramento, and Celeste in the bridesmaid dress she had been complaining about for weeks. Burgundy silk with a neckline she said was impractical for a woman who would need to carry a flower basket, and I looked up when she walked into the barn, and I looked for longer than the first rule allowed. She was standing with the florist, gesturing at something with the ease she always has when she is explaining something she actually understands, and the barn lights were behind her, and I looked for 4-5 seconds before I remembered to look away. She had already seen me. She raised an eyebrow, just a fraction, and turned back to the florist without changing her expression. But she had seen me, and I knew she had seen me. And something shifted in the air between us that evening that I did not name, because naming it would require doing something about it. I broke the second rule a week before the wedding. Celeste was spending the week at her sister's house in the Selwood neighborhood, helping with the final arrangements, and she called me on Tuesday evening to ask if I would drive her to pick up the wedding favors from the calligrapher, because Renata's car was in the shop, and Marcus's family had taken the rental. I said yes, because I always said yes when she asked me for something concrete and logistical, those requests I could honor without it meaning too much. I picked her up at 7, and we got to the calligrapher's studio in the Pearl District at 7:30, and the order took longer than expected, and by the time we loaded the boxes into my car, it was raining. A real rain. October serious. The kind that does not negotiate. The boxes had to stay dry, so we stayed in the car, waiting for a gap in the rain that never came. We talked about the wedding. We talked about Marcus, who was a contractor and seemed steady and genuinely amused by Renata, which Celeste said was exactly what her sister needed. Someone who found her entertaining rather than exhausting. We talked about Celeste's shift schedule at the hospital. She was a charge nurse in the cardiac unit, and how she had traded 3 Sundays to get the wedding weekend clear. We talked about a patient she had discharged that week, an 81-year-old man who had repaired church organs for 40 years, and told her that the human heart was the only instrument he had never learned to tune. She said it like she was just passing it along, but she looked at the rain on the windshield when she said it, and I said, "That's something," and she said, "Yeah." And then neither of us reached for the next topic. The rain on the roof was steady and close. The clock on my dashboard read 10:47, and I noticed it, the rule already broken, and I noticed that I was not moving to end the evening, and I noticed that she was not moving either. She had her shoes off, her feet up on the dash, watching the rain make channels down the glass. Her profile was very still in the way it gets when she is actually thinking, not performing thinking. She said, "Can I ask you something weird?" I said, "Sure." She looked at the windshield instead of at me. She said, "If you had never married Adrienne, if that whole thing had never happened, do you think you would be different?" I sat with that for a moment, watching a delivery van navigate the flooded intersection ahead of us. I said I thought I would be less careful with things, that I learned to be careful from loss, the way you learn to handle something fragile only after you have broken it. I said I thought I would have rushed more things. I said I was not sure if that was good or bad. She listened to all of that. Then she said, "That's not actually what I was asking." She said it quietly, not correcting me, more like noting a gap between what she meant and what I had answered. She did not explain what she had been asking. She put her feet down from the dash and said we should probably wait for the rain to stop, and we sat there until past 11, and the rain did not stop, and eventually we drove back in it anyway with the favor boxes in the back seat wrapped in her sweater. I thought about that conversation every day for the rest of the week. I turned it over the way you turn a movement in your fingers to catch the light on each surface, looking for the thing you missed. I was almost certain I knew what she had been asking. She had not been asking about Adrienne. She had not been asking about regret in the general sense. She had been asking something more specific, something that had us in it, and she had framed it the way she frames things she is not quite ready to say directly, sideways, through a hypothetical, with the door left open for both of us to walk through or not. I was almost certain, and almost is a very useful word for a man who has built his life around not breaking things. The day of the wedding, I put on a charcoal suit that needed pressing and pressed it badly, and I drove to the venue in the late morning to help with the setup because Celeste had asked me to, and I carried tables and moved chairs and untangled 60 feet of string lights with Marcus's younger brother, who was 17 and talked about basketball the entire time, and I was grateful for the basketball talk. Celeste was somewhere in the house with the bridal party all morning, visible only in glimpses through windows, and I only saw her once before the ceremony, at the side entrance, when she came out to check on the garden chairs and found me adjusting the angle of the last row. She was in the burgundy dress, her hair up in a way that looked effortless and had probably taken 45 minutes, and she stopped when she saw me, and she said, "You look nice," in the flat voice she uses when she is not trying to perform a feeling, the voice that means she means it. I said, "So do you," in what I hoped was a similarly flat voice. She looked at me for 1 second longer than necessary, which between us constitutes a significant pause, then went back inside. The ceremony was exactly what Renata had wanted, which was very small and not too long. Marcus cried during the vows, which made Renata cry, which made Celeste make the expression she makes when she is trying not to smile at something that is also making her want to cry. a kind of controlled collapse around the eyes. I sat in the third row and watched the whole thing with my hand in my jacket pocket, touching the weight of the watch I had brought without fully knowing why. It is a habit of mine, carrying a watch I am working on, the way some people carry a worry stone or a coin, something to turn in the fingers during the waiting parts of a day. But I had not brought a work watch. I had brought the watch from the drawer, the one with the white enamel face and the scratched crystal I had replaced 9 years ago. The one Celeste had left behind when she said she did not wear it anymore. I had put it in my pocket that morning, as if I were just carrying it. Reaching into the drawer for the shop keys, my hand had found the watch, and I had put it in my pocket, and I had locked up the shop and driven to the venue and spent 3 hours carrying tables. And only in the third row of the wedding ceremony, while Marcus and Renata said the things they meant to say to each other, did I become fully aware of what I had done. I had carried her watch to her sister's wedding. That is not the behavior of a man who has no opinion. That is the behavior of a man who has already, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, made up his mind. The ceremony ended. The reception moved into the barn. There was food, and there was music, and there was the hour of toasts, during which Marcus's father told a story about a fishing trip that had no obvious connection to marriage, but that, everyone agreed, was moving, in the way things are moving when they are about love, without saying so. Celeste gave a toast about Renata that was specific and funny, and ended on something true about the nature of being known by someone from the beginning. And she looked at her sister the whole time, not at her notes, and I watched her and thought, this is the thing about Celeste. She always knows exactly what she means to say. I sat at a round table near the back with a nurse friend of hers named Daniel and 2 of Marcus's cousins from Sacramento. Pleasant people who worked in solar energy and had opinions about hiking trails, and a great aunt named Marguerite who was 92 and had brought her own chocolate in a paper bag and offered it to everyone who sat near her, which I took as the social gesture of someone who has learned what actually matters at a party. I watched Celeste from across the room. She was good at weddings, easy in a room, in the way introverts sometimes are when they have a role, something to do with their hands and a reason to move between groups without being asked to perform. She talked to Marcus's family with the same focused attention she brings to everything, and twice I saw her make someone laugh the way she makes people laugh, sudden and genuine, the joke landing before you have quite caught up to it. She refilled her own water glass 4 times because she always forgets to drink enough when she is busy, and I noticed this from across the barn and thought, I know that about her, and she does not know that I know it. What I didn't know was how long I had been cataloguing these things. The small, private inventory of a person, not because I was keeping score, but because I could not help it, the way a watchmaker cannot help noticing the movement in a room, the tick, the rate, the quality of attention a thing requires. Celeste had been requiring my attention for years, and I had been giving it to her while pretending I was doing something more neutral. And then the bouquet throw, which happened earlier than expected, because Renata decided she wanted to do it before the formal dances while the energy was still high, and the DJ announced it, and the single women gathered at one end of the barn in the good-natured way of people agreeing to a slightly absurd ritual because the person they love wants it. Renata turned her back. The bunch of cream and ivory roses went up in a clean arc, higher than necessary, and Celeste's hands went up and caught it without a step backward, both hands, solid, and the women around her laughed and reached for her, and she looked immediately the way she looks when she has done something she did not plan, a brief moment of recalibration, and then she looked directly at me across the barn, and I did not look away. What changed everything was that neither of us looked away. We had spent years taking turns at that, one of us always yielding before the moment could become what it was becoming. This time, neither of us moved, and in that stillness, something was said that neither of us had to say out loud. She walked across the room, past the bar and the tables and Daniel, who saw her coming and turned deliberately in the other direction, and the great-aunt Marguerite, who watched her pass with the expression of someone who has seen this kind of walk before and knows what it means. She came to my table with the bouquet at her side, and she sat down in the empty chair, and she put her hand over my hand on the tablecloth, palm warm, fingers pressing down once, quiet and certain, and the string quartet was playing something unhurried. And that was the moment. I turned my hand over so our palms were together. I said, "In the car, in the rain." "You were not asking about Adrian." She looked at me directly, the way she looks at something when she has already made her decision and is just confirming the coordinates. She said, "No, I was not." I said, "You were asking about us." She said, "I was asking if you would have been brave enough sooner." She let a beat go by. "I'm not asking that now. I already know the answer." I looked at her. I said, "What's the answer?" She said, "No, but you're here now, so it doesn't matter." I took a breath. Outside the barn, the October dark was complete, and somewhere beyond that dark the city was going about its ordinary business, indifferent and familiar, and inside this barn there was music and the smell of late-season flowers and the weight of her hand in mine. And I said, "I have something of yours," and I reached into my jacket pocket and I brought out the watch, the white enamel face, the leather strap worn soft from years of being held in a drawer. She looked at it for a long moment. Something moved in her face, a recognition that went back further than I could track. She said, "You kept it." I said, "You left it." She said, "I left it on purpose." She picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something that has been waiting, and she held it in both hands, and she said, "I left it because I knew you would keep it. I knew that about you before I knew much else. I didn't know what to do with knowing it, so I just left the watch and figured I'd wait." I said, "That was 9 years ago." She said, "I know, I'm a patient person." And the corner of her mouth moved in the way it does when she is being dry about something that is also genuinely funny to her. I said, "I'm a watchmaker. I understand about things that keep time in the dark." She looked at the watch in her hands. The second hand was moving, steady, the way it had been moving for 9 years in my drawer. She said, "Is it accurate?" I said, "Within 3 seconds a day." She said, "That's better than I expected." I said, "I service it." I said it like a watchmaker, which I am, and she laughed the way she laughs at things that are both literal and absurd, a real laugh, unexpected and brief and completely honest, and it broke something open between us, some surface tension that had been holding since the beginning of the evening, maybe longer. We sat at that table for a long time while the wedding wound down around us. The dancing started and the bar got busy and the great-aunt Marguerite fell asleep in her chair and had to be gently guided to a different seat, and through all of it Celeste and I sat with our hands on the tablecloth, sometimes touching, sometimes just near, talking the way we always talk, except that everything meant a little more than it usually would, freighted with the acknowledgement of where we were and what we were not going to unsay. At some point Daniel came back from the bar, looked at us for exactly 1 second, said finally, and went to sit with Marcus's cousins. At some point the string quartet stopped and a single speaker started playing softer music, the kind that signals the end of a party without announcing it. Renata found us just before 10. She came across the floor in her dress and her flower crown, Marcus a few steps behind, and she stood at the edge of our table looking at our joined hands with an expression of someone confirming something they have known for a while. She said to Celeste, "I told you October." Celeste said, "You told me nothing of the kind." Renata said, "I told you in August that the wedding would sort it out. You just were not paying attention to me, which is not new." Celeste said, "That is historically accurate." They looked at each other in the specific language of sisters who have been having variations of this conversation their entire lives, and then Renata looked at me and said, "Take care of her." I said, "She takes care of herself." Renata said, "I know, that's why I'm telling you." And Marcus took her hand and steered her gently back to their table, and I watched them go and thought about what it looks like when someone knows what they have. We stayed until the barn was nearly empty. Celeste helped Renata's mother find her shawl, and I helped Marcus's brother carry the gift table boxes to the van, and by then it was past 11 and the last cars were pulling away and the barn lights were going out 1 string at a time. We stood in the parking lot in the cool October dark with our breath making small clouds between us, and it was the kind of quiet that comes after a long day when you have stopped performing anything. She still had the bouquet. She had carried it all evening without seeming to notice it, the way you sometimes carry something familiar without accounting for its weight. She looked at it now, the roses ivory-colored in the parking lot light. She said, "I did not actually want to catch this." I said, "You caught it with both hands." She said, "Reflex." She turned it over in her hands. Some things you reach for before you decide to. I thought about the drawer in my workbench where the watch had lived for 9 years. I thought about the pocket of this jacket. I thought about all the ways a spring holds energy that you cannot see, storing it patiently, waiting for the mechanism to decide the moment. I said, "I know something about that." She pulled one rose free of the bunch, white, small, the kind that blooms late and does not make a fuss about it, and she held it out to me without ceremony, the way she offers things she means. I took it. She kept the rest of the bouquet. We walked to the car in the October dark, and the drive back to Renata's house was 20 minutes through the city, and somewhere on the Hawthorne Bridge she fell asleep against the window with the bouquet in her lap. I drove carefully, watching the lights on the river, not because the road required it, but because I was carrying something I did not want to disturb. The rose was on my dashboard when I parked outside Renata's house. Celeste woke up clean, no disorientation, just present, the way she always is. She gathered the bouquet. She looked at me in the low dashboard light for a moment, unhurried, and she said tomorrow, and I said tomorrow, and she got out and went up the path to the house, and I waited until the door closed before I put the car in gear. I drove home through Portland at 11:30, over the bridges, through the neighborhoods going quiet, the city settling into itself. The rose was still on the dashboard. I did not touch it. In the shop the next morning I opened the drawer where the watch had lived. Empty now, the dark velvet lining pressed flat from 9 years of holding that one thing. I stood looking at the empty space for a moment, and I felt something I did not immediately have a word for, which turned out to be relief. The specific relief of attention correctly released, not broken, not dropped, just allowed to run at its natural rate. I closed the drawer and picked up my phone. I sent her a message that said, "Coffee, 10 o'clock. The place on Killingsworth with the bad chairs." She sent back, "The chairs are fine." I sent, "The chairs are terrible. You just like complaining about them." She sent, "That is historically accurate." I put my phone face down on the counter and sat at my workbench. The movement I was servicing was a 1960s automatic, Japanese-made, the rotor stiff from years of sitting unwound. I had the movement out of the case, cleaned and oiled, and I was fitting the rotor back into place, feeling for the resistance that tells you when it is seated correctly and when it is not. There is no sound for it. You have to learn to read the pressure through your fingertips, the difference between resistance that means stop and resistance that means almost. Through the shop window, the October light was thin and even, the kind that shows you everything without drama, and the street outside was going about its ordinary Tuesday morning business. Somewhere across the city, Celeste Avery was probably awake, probably making tea, probably moving through her sister's kitchen in the particular quiet of the morning after something. The watch was in her hands or on a surface near her, running. I had the rose in a glass of water on the counter. I set the rotor into place and felt it click, gentle and certain, where it was supposed to be. I picked up my tools and started the work of the day.